we've talked before when I said I don't see a connection between the Old and the New Testament, and you actually laughed a little bit. For example, it is day and night between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The way I personally see the New Testament is Jesus comes and he almost directly starts saying, hey, this is not the way. This supremacy driven thing is not the way. Separating yourself from others and others bad, me good, others bad is not good. And overall, his teachings are not, he's not reconfirming this God's teaching. He's actually going the opposing this God's teaching in a very, of course, diplomatic way. And the only reason I think the connection happened is because Jesus was an Israelite. And of course, anytime he talks to his people, he has to make sure that he's making references that make sense to his people, right? So hence he's going to have to reference their books. But when he talks to somebody else, he's going to either keep the references universal, or if he knows about their history, then reference their books. Jesus appears to be extremely well traveled. And when you look at what he's actually teaching, I don't think today's Christians, majority of them, are practicing what Jesus at the core was teaching. And that is a combination of many incredible ideologies or isms. For example, you can see clear like side by side with Stoicism, with Taoism, with Hinduism, with Buddhism, even Zoroastrianism and cynicism. It's funny, we talk about cynicism sometimes today in a more negative light, right? Like you say, oh, it's a cynic. But actually cynicism was it's to be more grounded, to be more realistic in what they're seeing, and also to actually stand up to power, to question power, which is precisely what Jesus was teaching also. I agree with Jews, actually, that Jesus was not the Messiah, because they were waiting for a king, a form of a Messiah that would come and take their kingdom back, which equals to destruction, violence. Obviously, you can't not go to war without, you can't just magically just be restored, right? You're going to go to war, you're going to claim your lands, a lot of death and destruction. And for that to be successful, you do have to create this us and them type of thing, so that you don't view the people you're going to destroy as, you don't get it's not on your conscience as in it's a bad thing. You know what I'm saying? It's very similar to, I think, Islam. Like when I see how Armenia and Azerbaijan political thing is going, one is Islamic, one is Christian. Azerbaijani people have been raised to think of Armenians as pretty much not human. So they actually do not think when they're killing an Armenian, that's a bad thing. In fact, they think that's a great thing. So I'm just seeing basically this nationalism thing just to have been built in the Old Testament, and them being the central figures and the chosen ones, that should not be part of Christianity, because Jesus was saying the exact opposite of that we should love our friends and including our enemies. We should have that consciousness. And just I just don't understand how we have gotten to a point where there are hardcore Southern Christians here that absolutely do think, oh, Jews are the chosen ones, which means they're God's people. But if you're Christian, then they're not your God's people.
I look at this whole phrase of like the chosen people a little bit differently too, because it does give this sense of like superiority or something when you really just think about it in a very in its basic context. But I think it's more of this thing of right now, currently, right, whether we're reading the Old Testament or the New Testament, it was written by the Jewish people. And
I do have
so,
to correct you on that, because you said that last time. New
mm,
Testament,
mm-hmm.
Luke is not Jewish. Mark is potentially not Jewish. There are actually non-Jews who wrote the book as well, including the Gospels.
The Mark is definitely Jewish.
He says possibly not a Jew, definitely Hellenized. If a Jew, then Hellenized.
Oh well,
But
almost everyone
Luke
was
is not
Hellenized
a Jew.
then, because what we need to also understand is that there were a lot of Jewish people who weren't Hebrew was not their first language anymore. It's kind of like
Yeah.
now where we're living in America, and so people are speaking English, but the book that they would have read then at the time of Jesus, the Old Testament that they would have been reading and studying would have been the Greek Septuagint.
Yes, because it
They
was,
right.
yeah.
They would have been reading the Greek Septuagint at that time. And in fact, when they do quote Old Testament scriptures in the New Testament, they were actually quoting from the Septuagint, or more so accurately to the Septuagint than the Masoretic text. I don't know if you know what that is either, but the Masoretic text.
Not
That's
that
what
one.
that's what
I know the other one.
most Bibles, most English Bibles or New Testament Bibles, they're all kind of they're using the Masoretic text to retranslate the Old Testament, because the Masoretic text came out 1,000 years after the Septuagint, but it went back to the biblical Hebrew. But it also drastically changed some things there, and we weren't really aware of that. We just kind of like went with the Masoretic text for a long time. But the thing that really helped bring us back was the Dead Sea Scrolls. So once we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we realized that those, because those are very very old copies, some of them uh, dating back to like 300 BC if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
They would those texts were more closely uh, paralleled to the Septuagint than the Masoretic text, which is 1,000 years after. So, and they were in Hebrew. They were written in Hebrew. They weren't written in Greek. And but it's interesting because we've slowly moved away from the Greek Septuagint as far as the using it as Old Testament
Yeah.
writings. But we don't. I mean, the New Testament changed several times once we got there. Within the first 300-400 years, the New Testament went through several changes. In fact, it's interesting that you bring up the idea here and now about uh, this God being like a flawed God. It's really interesting because in the first century, there was a group of people. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Gnostics.
I know the term.
Okay, Gnostics.
Yeah.
The Gnostics were maybe the Essenes. They were probably maybe in the same group of people. They were sort of like mystical type of writers, but they specifically spoke about how they were saying Jesus was saying that there was a God that's being followed that isn't the right God. It's not the same God. It's not the God of creation. It's not God
Yeah.
the Father. And that the Jewish people at that time in the Hellenistic period, the Jewish people at the time were following this flawed God. He
Mm-hmm.
literally says that within the Gnostic writings, which is interesting because we don't, as Christians, Protestant Christians and stuff like that, nobody reads Gnostic writings. Most people maybe have just barely heard of it. Most people would be maybe even afraid to read something like this, even though I think it's very interesting because yeah, it's basically talking about how I think they call him Yaldo
Mm-hmm.
Beeth, and he is like this god that's controlling the earth. And we're going to go through some of the Old Testament scriptures, and you're actually going to see where there has been given dominion of the earth to another entity of some sort, right? Call him Satan, call him whoever, but um,
Yeah.
is in control. And then there's God standing back and outside of all of that, which is the Father, which we're able to pass straight to. Um,
Yeah, and I think even in whichever books made it to the New Testament, even in those you can clearly see Jesus almost revolting against the other God, uh, in again diplomatic way. But I do want to draw some parallels next to each other, like Jesus' teaching versus the Old Testament teaching.